Hello everyone, and welcome back to this next video in the Houdini Academy Foundation module. This video is a continuation of the last one, where we're going to finish off the Extrude and Texture node, so we can have our texturing system for our main building asset. So I'm going to start simple. Let's create the system to texture the top and bottom of our extrusion first. So we already have the system here for that, and I'm going to appropriate that for our new texturing feature. Let's plug this in first. And we'll start with the bottom and the top. So I'm gonna copy that, plug it in, and I'm gonna give this its own netbox right here. So this part is going to be the part that we need to use to texture the top and bottom of our mesh. This is going to be the UV top and bottom. I'm just going to position this so it doesn't overlap anything. Maybe grab all of this, grab that network, grab that part, move it a bit over. Okay, keep it nice and neat. Okay, and then let's go ahead and hook up our new parameters for the texture, right? Because right now we have our parameters, but they're still all set up like they were in the simple Unreal texture node. And we need to change this so we have parameters specifically for our bottom material, our top material, and later also our side as well. So let's get started on these first, and then we'll deal with the side after. Let's open this up, go to our type properties, and what I want to do is change out this texture folder a bit so it looks more like in our example file. Now let me pull up that example here and I'll show you what I want to make this into. Over here I have our textures folder, and then I have the ability to determine for each of our different UVs what type it is, and then their offset as well. So let's start with the top and bottom UVs. And for these, we're going to keep our original setup the same. So this part here is going to be duplicated for both the side top and the bottom. And then this part is going to be mostly relevant for the bottom and top. And we'll make a custom system for the sides. So first, in this setup here, let's go ahead and move these ones over into the main folder. So we don't need this subfolder anymore. Now I do want to create some folders here for the bottom, the top, and the sides. And the way how I've set this up here is that I have a drop down, so we don't have everything expanded at the same time, which gets a little busy, right? And this will only work in Houdini. These types of drop downs don't work properly in Unreal, so we'll keep it for the utility nodes for us when we want to have a clean interface. But basically, let's go ahead and add two folders in here, like so. Drop them inside one another. Then let's grab all of our parameters and let's drop them into the bottom folder, the deepest folder level. I'm going to change this folder into a simple type, and I'll call it the bottom, like so. The folder above that is going to be a collapsible folder, and I'm going to change this one to bottom UVs. So now if I apply this change, we now have a drop down right here. Inside of that is a simple box, and then in there we have our settings. Now I don't need this toggle anymore, so I'm gonna remove that one. And I also don't need our projection axes anymore. Now if we remove this parameter, then over here it's going to also disconnect them over here. Now it might keep the expression, and that depends on what your current settings are. So if you go to the preferences under edit and then go to the miscellaneous folder, what you want to do is have it either set to automatically delete only simple channel references or automatically delete all references. Personally, I prefer this one because I don't like it when it removes very complex expressions when only one of its components gets removed. So I'm going to keep it on the automatic delete only simple channel references. And then I'll accept that. Now if I go and delete this here, this projection axes parameter is a simple reference because it's only one parameter reference right there. So if I delete this and I apply that, it should remove that expression altogether. And with that, as long as we set this to Y and we make sure it is set to Y, both of these should work. Both of these should be fine. Now I will configure these nodes in a minute. We do need to actually remove that group over there, but I'll do that in a moment. So over here in my folder, I want to change a couple of the names so they reflect better what they actually do. In this case, we're working on the bottom, so let's rename this one to preview bottom texture. And this one I'll rename to preview bottom texture. I don't want to make this too long, so this will do. For the Unreal material, let's make this Unreal bottom type. And this I'm going to call Unreal bottom material. So while recording this video, I noticed I made a mistake. This should be Unreal bottom type and Unreal bottom name. Just follow the subtitle here and you'll get the correct values. And then for these parameters down here, I'm going to change it over to bottom pivot. Let's say bottom texture pivot. This is going to be bottom scale. That's going to be bottom offset. And then finally the angle is going to be bottom angle. Okay. Now, as for the values in this case, what I would like to do is limit the texture offset between -1 and 1. And this is because I'm moving the texture over by the UV coordinate space, not the world space. So if I move it over by 0.5 in, say, the X channel or the U channel in this case, then it's going to move the texture by half its own width in the UV space, right? So if I look at that one again, if we move it by half a unit, this entire thing is going to be offset to about there. That's what I mean with that. Okay, so with this, the bottom should be set up. So let's click apply, and that should change all my values down here. And we still have our drop downs. We still have our instance system, and it will still be hooked up to these nodes, at least most of it, right? And then let's duplicate this setup for the top as well. So I'm going to grab all of these, copy, and then paste. And in this case, it's pasted them inside one another. I don't want that. So let's grab this Bottom UVs folder, this new one, and drop it on top of our textures folder. So that will drop it below, like that. And now I want you to make sure that you grab the ones with the number 2s inside. So that's our copy. I'm going to rename that one to top UVs. So let's rename everything again. Again, this stuff takes some time. Make sure you remove the 2, by the way, when you see it. But just go through the motions, remove all of these, and then we should be done soon enough. This one's going to be top pivot. Top scale. Top offset, and finally top angle. Okay, so if we apply that, then now we should have a secondary drop down right there for our top values as well. Now let's go ahead and hook this up. So over here we have our nodes, right? And we need to rehook them up. Now right now they will all be hooked up to these parameters here, all the bottom parameters. So we need to go and switch that out. And also I want to change my group over there, because I don't want this to be assigned to a group anymore. If it comes into these nodes, it will always be assigned. So we don't need a group. Let's go and delete the group field for all of these nodes. So delete the channel, remove the value, and then just do that for every one of these nodes. Okay. And the last one. All right. So with that set up, now we need to change the names on this set so they reference the top and not the bottom, because these ones are hooked up properly, but these ones aren't. So let's go in here, go to our UV transform node for the top section, right? Under the transform, not the reverse node. And then let's go to all these parameters and let's change them out. So there's two ways to do this. Either you grab the references here and you plug them in manually, or you replace them by hand. In this case, we could say grab our offset, right? Plug it into our translate here. Make sure it's the correct transform node before you do this. Then we'll replace it there. Then let's grab our top angle. Replace that. Grab our scale. And then finally the pivot. That will deal with the transform node and its behavior. Okay, so if we change these values, it should reflect it in here. All right. Now let's go over to our Unreal material. Let's expand that string. And I want to change this over to top everywhere you see bottom. Okay, so let's say Unreal top type. Like so. And then if we accept that, we should now have a string field here. If we give it a value, let's say we fill this in. There we go. So now we have this working, and we should be able to change our material or material instance too. Okay. Then under the preview material, we also need to make sure this is set up. So this is going to be preview top texture and preview top texture down there. And then last, we also need to do this for the quick shade. So let's go over here. Let's set this one up as well. Okay, so now we can actually go ahead and test all this out, because this should be set up. Let's go and change our settings. We can scale our texture, that works. We can change the texture pivot for if we want to rotate it. So and then we can offset our texture either to the left or to the right. And I seem to be able to move it too far, so I'm just going to go back, go to our top texture offset, and I'm going to limit it between -1 and 1. Apparently that wasn't set up properly. Let's accept that. So we can move it either way, but we can never move it too far. There's no need to move it further, I think. And the same thing for the top and the bottom. And then we can rotate as well. Alright. Now, next. This will basically project a texture based on the UV coordinates of this bounding object. But maybe we want to do this based on world space, right? Because right now this entire texture is being projected on top, maybe the entire floor of our building. Let's imagine this is the floor of our building. I don't want this to be this big. So I might also want to be able to project it based on world space. In that case, instead of using a UV texture node, we are going to use a UV project node instead. So let's create one of those. Let's start here at the top. Let's plug that in. And we're going to call this one UV project top. Now, as for its values over here, let's have a look at it. If we look at it using the widget, right, the handle tool, you can see which way it's currently projecting. Now, what I like to do is rotate it around so it's projecting downwards. So we can rotate it on its x-axis by 90 degrees. And that will project it down. Now, if I go and look at my end result, and I switch this one over to the correct mode, and you can see that we have UVs and they're very small. It is repeating the texture basically. That's fine by me, but we do need to be able to configure this. So what we can do now is plug up some of these parameters so we have them on our control panel, right? Let's go over here and grab from our settings the top texture scale, copy that, and I want to plug it in here. So if we reference that one, then now we can control the scale of this. And that will change the projection size, basically. Then the angle, let's copy that one. And I'm going to plug it into the rotate Y. And that will rotate our projection like this, along the world Y axis. So let's plug this in. And now we can control the orientation of our texture. And then next, let's set up the translate values. So for this one, we can grab our offset. Let's grab offset X here, plug that in. So we get our well, offset U channel in this case, because this is a UV type parameter. And then let's copy this one as well, plug it in over here. Now this is going to project in world space. So if I move this, it's going to move it by 1 unit in world space. And that will be fine if our textures are 1 unit in size. But it doesn't properly move it over here. Now I would like to be able to see a bit better how this texture is tiling, right? So let's switch it over to something like granite floor tiles over there, because it's a distinct pattern that we can easily make out. And then if I go and change my offset, then you'll notice how it's not properly moving the entire texture around. And it's a bit easier to see if I make this one actually one unit size. Now it's very repetitive. And if I move my offset by 1, then you see how nothing really changes. Because right now it's actually moving it at the same distance in world space as it is in texture space here. But the moment I scale this thing to say 1.5 each, and I set this to 1 offset again, then now it's no longer 1-to-1 moving it. So we're not actually moving it in UV space, we're moving it in world space. So to fix that, what we want to do is grab our scale, in this case in X, and multiply our translate X with that. So let's do this. Set it up like that. And then I'll copy the second scale value and multiply that by that. Now, if I were to move this, you can see how it now moves the entire texture. If I move it by 1 unit or 2, it's the same. So it's now moving it based on 1 unit in UV space. Now, based on our rotation, this is still going to break, because if I rotate it by, say, 10 degrees, I'm still moving the texture left and right in world space. I would like to actually move our texture left and right before I go ahead and rotate it. So we're going to change it over from scale, rotate, translate to scale, translate, rotate. If I do that and I rotate it, then now it moves based on UV space, not world space. So that's something that I wanted to set up here. Now there's one last thing that I want to deal with, and that's the pivot by which everything works here. Because right now it's set to world space, and if I rotate this thing, it's going to rotate around the world space pivot. But I might actually want to rotate this projection based on the corner of this building, like the corner of this object shape. And for that we need to move the pivot to either world space center or the corner of this building. Now, in order to get that value, I need to evaluate the shape of my model first. So let's build a system up here that does that, and then we can pull some information from there to these nodes, right? So up here, I'm going to create a texture coordinate null node. Let's create a null. And I'm going to put it up here because this is at the top of my network. And the reason I'm putting it in line here with the other nodes before everything is in order to make compiling a little bit more reliable. Now, I'm not going to go into compiling too much right now, but basically if I calculate all my variables out here and I make sure it's in line, then this will always calculate before everything else. So once I do the optimization pass on my toolset and this node will be compiled, right, it will always calculate this bounding data first, and then all the other nodes will grab from that. So we don't get some kind of order issue with the compile node. I won't go into that too much right now, but it's an issue I want to deal with right now. So up here, let's call this node texture coords, or texture coordinates, right? And this one is going to have a couple of different values. We need a texture pivot, a texture scale, and a texture center. And these values we're going to be able to pull from here and then later on use elsewhere in the network. But all this will really grab for us is the size of our object, the center of our object, and where we want the pivot for our textures to be on our object. So on this node, I'm going to create 3 values. Let's hide these parts of the null node first. And then let's grab 3 float vectors. First one is going to be texture pivot. The next one will be texture scale. And this last one is going to be texture center. Let's apply this, and that will give us some parameters to work with. And then we need to evaluate this information. Now, in our case, we are going to extrude this object, right? In a way. We're going to use this sweep node to give it some depth. So in order to make sure that the center of this object is properly evaluated, I'm going to copy the bottom layer here up by the extrusion height. So we emulate the object center. We basically create the top and bottom, but not the sides. So let's grab a copy node, copy and transform in this case. Let's plug that in, and then I want to grab the height of my node, so the extrude depth, copy that. I'm going to plug it into translate y. So this is going to simply copy our surface up, which will create a, let's say, an emulation of the bounding box of this object, okay? With only 2 copies. We should have just the bottom and the top. And then let's create a bound node, just so we can visualize this bounding box. We don't need it per se, but it's nice to be able to see it. And then I want to hook these two up. So let's add a spare input here. Grab our bound node. Plug that in. And then over here, I can grab the bounding information from this bound node. Let's say centroid, -1 for the reference, right? Spare input. And then d_x. I'm just going to copy that, paste it over here for y and z. Then I want to grab the bounding box size value, because now we have this. We need to know the size of this object. So up here, let's say bounding box -1, comma, and then d_x size. That will grab its size value. Copy that, move it over, and let's set this one to z. So that will give us the actual height and size in x and z. And then finally, let's also set up the pivot. Now for the pivot, I want to be able to toggle this from my interface. And for that, I need a new parameter. So let's open up our parameter interface on this node. And up at the top of our texture section, I want to add a new ordered menu, like there. Okay, inside of the texture folder, but outside of these specific UV folders here. Okay. And then let's name this ordered menu to texture pivot. And then for the values of this ordered menu, let's go to the menu tab. Let's say number 0 is going to be world center. And value 1 is going to be object corner. So if I apply that, we should now have a parameter here for that. So if we have our world center set up, then I want this to be 0 on all these channels, okay? Because that's the world center after all. But otherwise I want it to be in the corner of this in the negative direction on all axes. So let's plug this in. And over here, let's say if our parameter texture pivot is equal to 0, then we want it to be 0. Otherwise, if it's set to the object corner, I'm going to use bounding box -1 d_x min for the minimum x direction on this bounding box. And then we got to close it with a bracket, right? Because this is still inside of an if statement. And if we do that and we evaluate it, then if we set it to object corner, it should be, in this case, -5. Then I'm going to copy this expression and plug it in here as well. I'm going to change this to y. And then this one, I'm going to change this to z. So now we have, if everything is right, the ability to evaluate a corner of our object, and we can use that down below. So over here, on our UV project top node, I want to grab from up here, from my texture coordinate node, some of its values. Let's grab its pivot in x, y, and z, and let's plug this in. Like that. So now this node should be making a reference to our node up here. So that's the way how we are going to reference this. I'm doing it this way and not through some kind of bounding box expression on this node, because this way I have a dedicated node with all the coordinate information early on my network. And like I mentioned, I found this to be more reliable if we need to start dealing with compiling our network. So we don't get some kind of issue with that. It's not mandatory, but it seems to make it more stable. Now, before I continue, I'm going to make a little correction here and add a blast node above the copy node. because at this moment this bounding box is actually based on the entire object we feed it, not just on our selection. So I'm going to add a blast node up here and link it up to the interface as well. Let's create one of those, plug it in, and we'll say isolate group. Then we can grab from our interface our current group and drag it in over here. And then we just say non-selected. So in that case, if we grab this, we only have this as our bounding box. So we will only get that instead of the entire object, right? Now you won't see this in the rest of the video, but that's what I have at the final result. So let's continue. Now with this set up, and we can now test this out, let's go back to our quick shade. And if I change this to object corner and I rotate it, it will now rotate around the corner of my object. Likewise, it's going to scale from the corner of my object as well. So we have some more control over where our UVs are going to be, and that's useful all around. So let's set all of these back to their default values. And then I just need to set up the last parameter, which is for this switch. So let's open up the type properties again, go in here, and I'm going to go down below to our top UVs in this case. And then let's grab our parameter from our top section. And I'm going to plug it down here into my top section below. Let's add another separator in there. And then this should become an ordered menu. So let's switch that over. I'm going to rename this one to top projection method. And then under the menu, I'm going to set this up so 0 is going to be a orthogonal projection, and 1 is going to be orthogonal unitized. So the unitized one is based on the bounding of our object, right? And the other one is going to be a projection, so that's based on world space. So let's set this up, and I just want to make sure that I named this one correctly, because I noticed I didn't name this one to top. So let's fix that. Okay, now I'm going to copy this one with the separator and plug it in over there and change this one to bottom. So we have one for the top and we have one for the bottom. Now I'm going to leave the default values on these on 0. I'm fine with that. Let's go ahead and apply this. And then now we should have a control here. Let's plug this up. So let's copy that. Let's say rename this to top projection mode. That should already be plugged in because I dragged it over, right? And then here on the left, I'm going to set this one up to bottom projection mode. So let's grab our bottom one here. And let's plug that one in. Now at this point, we still need to copy over our UV project node, so let's do that too. Drag it over. I'm going to call this one bottom. And we need to also change all these values around over here. So give me a moment. Let's say bottom offset. Just do this step by step so you don't skip anything. I think as long as you pay attention and you're methodical about it, double check your names. You shouldn't be making any mistakes. But just in case, we are going to test this before we finish up. Now the pivots are going to be the same, so we don't need to change those. And with that, this one should be set up too. So let's test that out. Okay, so let's test it out. First, we can change the material from our drop-down. And if we do that, we update our settings down here so they match. That works. We can also change the material type for Unreal. So let's have a quick look at that. That works as well. Next, we have our different projection methods. If we change this between orthogonal projection and unitized, then one is going to be normalized if it's unitized. So it will occupy the full 0 to 1 space. If we try to scale this, then we scale it in this case from this bottom corner there. If we change our pivot on the other hand, we scale it from the center. So we can move our UVs this way, scale them in a different way. So that works as expected. We can also offset our texture if we want to. And that works in both directions. And we can rotate it. And again, that's based on the pivot as well. So for this one, it works. Then let's look at the standard orthogonal projection instead. For this one, we are projecting in world space, so our pivot here has no influence. And I actually want to disable that in a minute, so this actually gets grayed out if we're in this mode. But for now, if we scale this, then both scaling sides work. We can rotate our texture around. At the moment it's based on the object corner. If I move it to world center, it will rotate around that instead. And then finally we have the offset again, so we can offset our texture. And this is dependent on the scale. So if we set this to 5 each, we can see the entire texture does move. And you still get the same result if you set it to 0 or 1 or -1. So it's based on texture space, not object space, which is what I want. And then let's test out the bottom as well. Let's do that quickly. So over here, for our bottom, we can again change our material, so that works. We can change our projection type. And this one was already hooked up before. We started with the bottom and then we did the top. So our bottom shouldn't be broken in this case. Everything should still be functioning. So I'm a little less worried about this one. Okay. And that all seems to be working as well. So I'm just going to turn all of this back to its default values. And at this point, I think we are ready with the top and bottom systems. Now, like I said, I do want to make sure that the bottom texture pivot and the top texture pivot get hidden if their projection methods are set to projection and not unitized. So I'm just going to open this up and quickly set this up. So here we have our bottom projection method. Let's copy that. And if our bottom projection method is set to 0, then our bottom texture pivot is going to be disabled. Like that. Then I'm going to copy that. Let's go to our top texture pivot. And if our top projection method is 0, then we're also going to disable it. So if I apply that, then now you can see the pivot will be hidden because we can't use it if we're in this mode. But if we're in unitized mode, it is. Okay. So that's most of our UV node done, but we're still not quite there yet. We still need to actually do the sides. And I know this is quite a long process, UVs do take a while to set up, especially if we want to create a custom node for this, but it will make everything else so much easier when we're done with it. So the payoff is there. It just takes a bit of time to set up. But hopefully this helps you understand a little bit better how we can control UVs through parameters and then, create a node that helps us do this easily. Okay, so at this point we have 2 of the 3 UV layouts completed. We have the bottom and we have the top, but now we still need to deal with the sides. And for the sides we have 3 variations for the UVs. We can either lay out a orthogonal projection, just like before, in the X and Z direction independently, or we can also do a sweep-based UV layout. And the sweep-based UV layout comes from the sweep node. In that case, if we have, say, a UV quick shade to visualize this, plug that in. And I need to make sure that we actually have UVs. So let's go to our sweep. And on its UV and attributes folder, I'm going to tell it to compute UVs. If we do that, you can see that it is going to project UVs along the top order, along the V direction in this case, because the U direction is our line and the V direction is the line that we gave it initially. So that's how it determines that. If we want it to project in a sideways direction, we'll have to rotate this result. So let's go ahead and create a UV transform node for that. Maybe plug this in. And let's rotate it in the Z direction. So if we do that and we lay it on its side, then now our UVs should be lining up sideways. So I want to be able to control this, and for that I am going to plug this into my interface. So let's open up the type properties again. And in this case I want to add a new folder for the sides as well. So let's once again grab a folder. I'm going to name this one side UVs. Going to be a collapsible folder. And then let's drop another one in there, which we'll call sides, as a simple folder. So with that, we have that set up. And then I would like to create the side parameters next. Now for this one, I do want to copy some of my parameters from down here. First, let's grab all of the parameters that we have over here, all of them, and drop them in the sides folder, because I want to adjust these, okay? Now the first one here, let's change that over to preview side texture. Like so. This will be Unreal side type. Unreal side texture. Then these I'm going to call side projection method, and the same thing for the name. And in here, under the menu, I'm going to change this around. I'm going to add an extra value here. I'm going to call this 0. Then I'll move it up to the top. So that's going to be my default value. And I'll name this one sweep around. So that's going to sweep our texture around if it's in this mode. And then the other ones, I'm going to rename their tokens to 1 and 2. So we have 0, 1, and 2 for sweep, orthogonal projection, and then orthogonal unitized. Then let's move on. Under bottom texture pivot here, I'm going to change this one to side pivot. This one's going to be side texture scale. Side offset. and side angle. Okay, so with these all set up and the names correct, let's apply this. So now we need to plug that in. Let's go ahead and pull up our parameter panel again from over here. And under the side tab, let's put it over here for a second. I want to plug this in so the offset is plugged into my translate channel, like so. This is a UV transform after all. Then our rotation is going to go into this rotation channel. Now I probably do want to set this to a default value of 90, so we'll do that in a minute. Then we have the scale. Plug that in. And then finally, let's grab the pivot and let's plug that one in as well. So with that, we now should have control over how our sweep behaves. So let's change the scale. Let's make this smaller. Okay. Cool. That works. And it should still be wrapping around the corners like that. And then we can change the angle to say 90 degrees or something in between. Again, it still wraps around, so that's good. Basically, our UVs here are stretched out in the X direction now. And let me just hide that template. Okay. Then we have the offset, which again offsets the texture in texture space, so it will offset it 1 UV square, right? Or 2. Same thing for this. And then finally we can change the pivot. So let's say I change that to 0.5. Now it starts there in the middle. So we can rotate our texture based on the middle of the UV space and not the sides. Though that in this case only really applies to where the texture actually starts. So not as important for the sweep. Anyway, so with that set up, let's hook up the main method and the material assignment first, and then we'll deal with the last projection methods for the X and Z coordinates independently. So for that, let's grab over here a copy of this. And I'm going to plug it in. So this is the first input. This goes into our group node again. And I'll change this one to side projection mode. And then let's change the parameters as well. So over here, this is going to be side projection method. Should be this one. If you want to be sure this works, make sure you test it, or otherwise drag it in, right? Replace it. For the Unreal material, let's open this one up again with Alt-E. Then we're going to change this to Unreal side type. Unreal side text, and this one too. Now this should give us a material if we plug it in. So let's grab our granite again. So with our Unreal material set, we now have this, and we can also change our material type. Okay. So that works. Then we need to do the same thing down here. Let's set this one up. So this will be preview side texture. Okay. And then for this one, we need to also set up the quick shade, so that one works. Okay, so here is our texture being applied. So that works too. Let's double check everything one last time. Let's make sure it works. We have our rotation. That's correct. Then we have our texture pivot. So if we move that one, then that also works. We have our offset, which is working too, in the way how I want it to here. And then we have the scale, which also works. So with that, this should be set up. Okay, and then last I noticed I hooked this up wrong by accident at some point. So let's plug this in properly so we don't break this system. You might notice this is broken later in the video. It's because I'm fixing this in post. But now that I've returned it back to its default value, before I forget, let me set up this rotation. So it should be default 90 degrees. Let's go to the type properties again, go to the side angle, and let's change this to 90. So that should be good. Okay, so I'm going to grab all of this like that, add a net box around it, and let's call this one the UV sides. Okay. And then on the right, let's create some group nodes. So the first one is going to be a group node I'll call X direction, or X dir if you want. And I'm going to plug in from up here from my switch a channel like that, so we can grab on our geometry everything that points in the general X direction. And we can do that by switching this thing over into keep by normals mode. Okay. Now as for the name of this group, let's set that up first. It's going to be X dir for X direction. And then under the normal direction here, I'm going to set it so the direction is 1, 0, 0. So basically positive X. And as for its angle, I'm going to set that to 45 degrees. So if it's anywhere in the, let's say, X direction, right, it's going to be selected, otherwise not. Then I'm going to color this node red, because the X coordinate is usually a red color, right? Then I'm going to copy that, paste it below. Let's call this the X direction negative, like negative X direction. And for that group, I'm going to say union with existing. So in this case, it is going to add to the same group, but we're going to reverse the direction to -1. So this will select all the primitives in this orientation, but not in that one. Okay. And then let's go ahead and copy these, plug it in below. And I'm going to color these blue instead, because that's the Z direction, right? And this is going to be Z dir, like so. Then up here, for both of them, let's change it over to Z direction as a group name. And for its direction values, the first one is going to be 0, 0, 1, and the second one is going to be 0, 0, -1. So with that, we now have both our directions selected. Okay, so that's the first part. And then next, let's go ahead and set up the UV projections for the X and Z directions. Now in this case, we are going to use a similar system to what we did before. So let's just go ahead and copy this, copy that, and then paste it in here on the right. Now we do need to set this up so we can do it for both the X and Z coordinates separately. So I'm actually going to duplicate this up and plug it in below again. And then we need to set up some groups so these apply to only their respective direction. This one here is going to be named UV project side X. And then this one is going to be UV project side Z. I'm going to give these some colors again, so they're easier to recognize. And let's do the same thing for these ones on the right. So the top section here is going to be UV texture side X. And UV transform side X. And that one's going to be side Z. And so forth. Now let's hook up the groups. So this one, or these three basically, are going to be set up to X direction. And the bottom three are going to be the Z direction. So now these ones will deal with the projection for one orientation, and these one for the other. But first, let's plug this into the switch, and then we need to configure our parameters on the interface. So I'm just going to grab all of this, drag it down a bit, make a little bit of space. Like so. And then let's plug in these UV projects first, and then the UV texture and transforms. So that should now be set up properly based on our interface, right? Now as for their values, let's go to the type properties again. And in this case, what I would like to do is copy all of this twice, because I need to have separate UV coordinates for the independent parts in X and Z. So let's copy that over twice, and then we need to change the names. So in this case, I'm going to change 2 to X, and let's say side X texture pivot, and then the same thing for the rest. So like so. And then for these ones, we need to set them to Z. So let's just do that quickly as well. So yeah, once again, once you have to set up a lot of parameters on your tools, it always takes a bit of time. And unfortunately, I can't make this type of thing any faster if I'm going to show you in a one-to-one fashion, right? So thanks for bearing with it. But again, like I said, you'll see a good tool at the end. So let's go ahead and make sure this is all configured properly. In this case, I'm going to take my rotation and I'm going to set it to 0 for both of these, because I don't want that default value to be changed here. Side scale is fine, side offset is fine, and the pivot is also fine. And if I go and apply this, then now on our interface we will have UV parameters for every single side. Now I don't want these to be visible if they're not in the right mode, right? If we are in the sweep method, I only want these top ones to be visible, otherwise only the bottom ones. So over here, let's go to our side projection method, grab that, and then under side texture pivot, let's start setting these up. So within curly brackets in the hide when field, I'm going to say if it's not equal to 0, we'll hide it. And let's copy that over to all the other parameters as well. Also maybe the separator over here. Then under the side X texture pivot, let's plug this in again, but now we're going to say if it is equal to 0, we're going to hide it. Copy that, and let's paste it into everything else below. So then this will be hidden. Almost done. Okay, so now if we apply that, we should only have our parameters when we need it. If we go to sweep, we have these, otherwise we have those. And then finally, we need to go ahead and set this up properly. So let's start with the project nodes first. Now right now, these project nodes are not pointing in the correct direction, so we need to fix their orientation before we do anything else. Let's say the X direction is going to be this way. So let's remove this expression here. Set that one to 0. And I think I need to rotate this by 90 degrees. So if we do that, then now we have a projection along the X direction based on our gnomon in the corner there. And then if we want to rotate this correctly, we need to rotate it, I believe, in the Z direction. But we flipped around some of our transforms. So if I start to rotate this, you'll notice that it actually always rotates in the same orientation. And that's not something we want. So to fix that, we need to change our rotation order here as well. Let's first make sure we rotate in X and Z, and then we rotate in Y. Now, if we rotate, we will rotate along the Z direction here, while we still maintain this correct orientation, like that. So X, Z, Y in this case. Let's grab our rotation value from our parameters for the X direction. Let's plug that up. So now we should have control for that. Okay. Then we need to set up the other ones too. So for the scale, I'm going to just grab this and override it, like so. However, for the offset value up here, this is a complex expression, so we will have to set this up either by hand or rewrite it. In this case, I'll just try to do it by hand. Let's say side offset XU, like that. And then this one should be side scale XU. Okay. And then for this one, I'm going to change this one to side offset XV. And then that's going to be side scale XV. So now this should be hooked up. Let's quickly test it out. So if I change my side offset in X, then it changes. If I change the scale in X, it also changes. So this one's hooked up. And then the Y channel also works. So for these, we know it works. Then let's do the same thing for the one below. We need to set this one up too. Let's grab that one. And in this case, we need to rotate this one to point in that direction. So I'm going to delete this one again. Return everything to 0. And now, if I rotate in Z, it is rotating in the correct orientation. So let's plug that one up too. Let's grab this one here, side Z texture angle, plug that into rotate Z on the blue node. So now this should rotate. Okay. And then we need to adjust the rest. So again, basically grab the scale, plug it in here, Z scale, yep. And then up top, this is going to be side offset ZU, side scale ZU, and here too. ZV, side there, ZV. Okay, just double checking. Should be all right. Let's double check everything. This is a multiplication, so if something goes wrong, it will break, right? If we change the offset values, that works. Change the scale, it also updates. Okay. All right, so let's test that one out. Let's go to our projection. make sure it's in projection mode, so mode 1, right, over here. And then under our settings, we can go ahead and change this. So we can change the material, something else. We can change the scale, in this case in X only, right? That functions, that works. Offset works. It can't go over 1 and 1, but as you can see, the result is the same. So if I set it to 0 or -1 or 1, it moves it in the correct UV space. So the result is the same. Anything in between though, and it's gonna pan basically. And then rotation. And again, rotation is based on the texture pivot, so we can change that around too. Now let's test the bottom as well. So for its offset, that one works too. And rotation works too. So now let's go ahead and deal with the last set of my UV coordinates here, the orthogonal unitized set. So I'm going to switch it over to that, and immediately we see things are broken. So we are going to have to change our projection direction. In this case, we need to change it to the X orientation. So that works. And then over here, we don't need to change anything. But inside of our transform node, we do have to change these. So let's switch it over. Let's grab our parameters again. So I'm just going to grab from over here our pivot, plug that into the pivot, overwrite that. So it should be side pivot X, U, and V. Then the scale, like that. We have the angle, which should still be the Z channel, because we are working now in UV space, and the Z channel rotates in UV space. As you can see, it's blue, right? Blue is usually Z. And then we have the translate for the offset, like that. So let's quickly test this and then do the last one. So here we have the X direction of our projection. We can change the scale independently, and you can see how it scales over here as well. Better not set that to 0 because it will stretch, right? Then we have the offset. Again, it moves in 0 to 1 space. If I change the scale of my texture, it still moves in 0 to 1 space. So it does work. For its rotation, it is rotating around the 0 coordinate. And if we then change the pivot, again, then now we are rotating around that. So in this case, we are using this pivot, not the world center pivot. And now let's deal with the bottom ones for the Z channel. So we're almost done. For this one, we need to make sure it's pointing in the Z direction, right? And then let's hook it up. So let's go to our transform Z. And let's plug these over. So again, our side Z texture pivot goes here. Our scale goes there. Our offset goes up top. And then the texture angle goes in the Z channel on the rotate. Okay. So now, let's test this one out again. So our offset's working. We can offset our texture. Then we can scale it. Okay. We can change the pivot. And we can rotate around that. Okay, so at this point, I think we are pretty much done. We have set up every single one of our UVs and all of our setups. Let's go ahead and double check everything at the end, and then I think we can wrap up this video. I do still want to install this tool into my tool set, but I think I will have to do that in the next one. So let's quickly make sure this node works, and then we can go and wrap this one up. And we'll install it and test everything properly in the next video. Okay? So from our interface, let's set up the side projection, and I'm going to use sweep. So let's say sweep around. And in this case, I want to grab the concrete bars. Okay? So the concrete bars are these nice little patterns that we can use for the edges of a lot of concrete elements, right? So not the front or the back, but say in between, like say in the windows, for example, like over here, like that, or perhaps over here on the elevators. So for those, if we change the scale on these, so for this one, let's change the size to 0.21. That will stretch it out nicely along one of the bars in my texture. And then we can maybe scale it a bit, so we can create this nice continuous concrete texture all around. Then let's go ahead and set it up so we have a top. This would actually be a good top texture, so let's keep that. I'm going to use orthogonal projection, because ultimately if this is a floor, I don't want it to be unitized because it would scale way too big. That's better suited for smaller elements that are kind of fixed in size, right? Like for example, the elevator tops, which are a fixed size, but therefore they need to have their UVs within that space. And then if we have this one, we can scale it, but at least it will be the same size respectively. But for the floors, that's different. The floors need to be in world space, so that's why we are going to use the projection method right there. Let's scale this one up a bit though, make it a little bit larger, maybe like 3. Okay, and we can try to rotate it if we want to, offset it. That all works. And then let's do the bottom as well. So here we have the bottom. And for the bottom, let's pick, say, a red brick material. Okay. So this is for the walls, for the outside of the building. So we can grab that and scale it up a bit. And maybe offset it as we want to. That all works. Or we can rotate it. Okay, so this works. Now, like I mentioned, our tool can only extrude in an upward direction. That is a limitation of this utility. However, on the other hand, if we had to set this thing up so it could extrude sideways or in any diagonal direction, it would get a lot more complicated. So I'm going to keep it simple for this. We don't really need it to be more complex. And if we do need to extrude our walls out, like we need, for example, like I showed you here for the building, then all we really need to do is take our original tiles, rotate them so they are flat on the ground, like this, then extrude them, and then rotate them back. So that's a way for us to get around that issue. And next to that, the projection here in X and Z will only work in one orientation because I haven't set it up for each side separately. For that I would have to, I suppose, duplicate these again and then change their settings around so they're mirrored. So in other words, this texture here is going to be a mirrored projection of the texture on the other side, which means that one of these two UVs is actually reversed, right? If you want to fix that, go ahead. It's something to keep in mind, but I'm not going to bother with it in this case. I don't need it in my project. If you do, then feel free to duplicate some of these nodes and reverse them and fix that. So with that, I think this node is done. I'm going to go outside the network, save it out. match the definition after you've saved. Okay. And then with that, we should now have this properly set up. Thank you for watching this video. I know it was a very long one and it was a bit dry. Unfortunately, I can't make this any faster. I can't make it any easier. Setting up parameters like this takes a while. Configuring UV systems takes a while. And I wanted to make a utility node that did all this stuff for me, because applying it to our entire network like this per piece would be incredibly mind-numbing to do. So I would rather just deal with it in this video, fix it here, and then we can just duplicate this node all over our network and get it over with. Okay. So yeah, that's the benefit of utilities. Take something you don't want to do too much, break it down, simplify it, make it into a repeatable, easy to use system, and then just use it all over the place. So, thank you for watching this video. In the next video, we are going to integrate this node into our building. That's going to be the second part of this. So I would just like to say, if you've been following through this video, you've done really great. Thanks for watching and keep learning, because in the next video, we're going to integrate this and then our building will finally have materials. And then we can keep going and add the elevators and the staircases and the balconies. Really go and wrap up this project. Okay, add a bow around it, finish it up. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Have a good one.